It was the winter of 1940. Britain's breath came out in fog. The war had already swallowed France, and now, night after night, the skies above England glowed red with flame. At airfields from Norfolk to Kent, ground crews worked through the cold until their hands bled, tightening bolts by torchlight, checking gauges through sleepless eyes. They were fighting not only the Luftwaffe, but the weather, the machines, and time itself. Engines coughed and failed in the dark. Crews that took off full of hope were falling from the sky before they reached the channel. The cause was not bullets or bombs. It was something invisible ice forming inside the heart of the engines. Carburetor icing, a quiet, merciless killer. Inside one of those battered hangars, beneath a leaking roof, a man stood over an engine block half, buried in frost. His name was Arthur Mallory, a metallurgist turned emergency engineer, once a quiet factory technician, now drafted into the chaos of war. He wasn't a soldier. He had never fired a gun, but he'd seen more death than most men at the front. When the reports came in, they all read the same: engine failure at altitude, cause unknown. Mallory stared at the twisted metal on his workbench, shards of a Merlin engine brought down from a crashed bomber. Oil mixed with frost along the torn edges, a strange kind of beauty in its destruction. He traced a finger along the crack in the intake manifold, felt where the ice had formed and split the metal like glass. Around him, the air smelled of petrol, iron, and despair. Outside, the morning fog was so thick it muted every sound. Somewhere far off, a siren wailed, then faded. He leaned against the cold fuselage of a grounded Wellington and watched vapour rise from his breath. Men were dying up there not because of enemy fire, but because no one could keep an engine breathing above 20,000 feet. For the pilots, it happened like a nightmare. One moment, the hum of the engine, the next, a choking silence. Ice crystals formed inside the carburetor, starving the engine of air. Altitude turned from ally to assassin. Mallory knew it wasn't a new problem. Carburetor icing had haunted aviators since the first days of powered flight. But never on this scale, and never with such cruelty. In the freezing heights where British bombers had to fly, even a thin mist could spell death. He looked over at the men working nearby. Young technicians barely out of school huddled over a bench, heating tools over a brazier to keep their fingers from freezing. Their laughter was tired, hollow. The war had turned everyone into something else. Mechanics became medics. Scientists became priests, whispering prayers over dying machines. Mallory's superior, Colonel Graves, stepped into the hangar, trench coat flapping in the wind. Another one went down last night. He said quietly, "North Sea, no survivors." Mallory didn't look up. Same symptoms, Graves nodded. Same damn thing. Engine froze solid before they reached target height. Command's losing patience, Arthur. They need answers. I'm giving them everything I've got. Then give more. The Colonel's tone softened for a moment. I know it isn't fair, but we're running out of men faster than we're running out of engines. The door slammed shut behind him, leaving the echo to settle in the silence. Mallory returned to the engine block. His fingers brushed over the frost, and he thought of the crew who once relied on it. 4 men. He didn't know their names, but he carried their ghosts. Every failure was personal now. He had tried everything, new alloys, heating elements, redesigns. Each attempt failed in the same way, ice creeping into the carburetor throat, strangling the airflow. At 30,000 feet, the air grew thin and cruel. Moisture froze faster than thought. He began keeping a small notebook in his pocket, sketches, equations, ideas scribbled in pencil between test runs. The pages were smudged with oil and sweat. One line repeated over and over, "Keep the temperature alive." But how do you keep something alive in a world built on cold? Night fell early that winter. In the barracks, the men spoke of home, of letters delayed, of wives and children waiting. Mallory sat apart, his tea untouched, staring at the thin steam rising from the cup. Steam, he watched it twist and vanish into the air warm against the cold. It rose, disappeared, then reappeared near the lamp. There was something hypnotic about it, the way it changed from water to vapour, from visible to invisible. The transformation was perfect, complete, but he didn't understand yet, not then. The days blurred together. Engines arrived broken and left in pieces. He'd stand for hours at the test rig, the scream of the turbines filling the shed like thunder. Sometimes the engines would cease so suddenly the sound would cut off mid-roar, leaving an aching silence. Mallory's assistant, Peter, would shout over the noise, "It's the mixture again." "No." Mallory would answer, "It's the cold. The cold is alive in there." The men thought he was losing himself. Maybe he was. He began working through the nights, the hangar lit only by a single bulb swinging on its wire. Outside, frost crept across the windows like slow lightning. Inside, Mallory scribbled on scraps of paper, numbers looping into madness. He thought of the pilot's young men with faces burned into his memory, and the silence that came over the radio when their engines failed. One by one their call signs became ghosts. Falcon 9, lost contact. Kite 3, lost contact. Each one another weight on his chest. He'd walk outside just before dawn, hands numb, eyes burning, and listen for the distant hum of returning planes. Some nights none came back. The war didn't feel like strategy or glory anymore. It was a slow drowning, and the water was made of cold. By February he'd filled 4 notebooks, still no solution. Command had begun to consider grounding the bombers until spring, an impossible thought. Mallory's colleagues whispered behind his back. Some said he'd gone mad, others said he cared too much, but he didn't listen. Every failure brought him closer to something he just didn't know what. He would run his hand along the side of a wing coated in frost, feeling the thin crust crack beneath his palm, ice forming from nothing. That was the enemy. He spent one evening testing a crude heating coil system, a desperate idea borrowed from car radiators. The test engine roared, sputtered, then burst into flame. The explosion blew out the window and covered him in soot. Peter dragged him out coughing. "You'll kill yourself doing this." Mallory only stared at the burning wreck. "Better me than them," he whispered. The next morning he received a message from Graves, final attempt, results needed within a week. Mallory folded the paper and tucked it into his coat. He didn't need to read it twice. He worked until his fingers blistered. Coffee turned to cold sludge beside him. He didn't shave, didn't sleep. Each failure felt like the war itself, loud, senseless, endless. The engine groaned, the gauge needles quivered, and then another freeze. He slammed his fist against the table, tools rattled. Something inside him broke a little more. For the first time, he thought of giving up. That night, the airfield was silent. Snow had begun to fall, thick and heavy, muting the world. Mallory sat alone in the small mess hall, the only light a weak bulb above his table. He unbuttoned his collar, rubbed his eyes, and reached for the kettle. The water inside had cooled, so he set it back on the small stove. He watched as it began to tremble, a soft hiss building into a whistle. Steam poured out, curling through the dim light. He leaned closer. The condensation gathered along the metal lid, droplets forming, running, evaporating. Something about it stopped him. The movement, the warmth flowing through metal, transforming water into vapor. It was simple, yet perfect. He opened his notebook and wrote one word, vapor. Outside, the night was still. The snow kept falling. The sound of distant engines echoed faintly over the hills, bombers heading out again into the dark. Mallory closed his eyes. The image of the kettle lingered. The hiss of steam merged with the sound of those engines fading into the distance. He didn't know it yet, but the idea had already begun forming fragile, hidden alive. The seed of something extraordinary, born not from brilliance, but from exhaustion. Approx. 3 zeros. 00 words voiceover. Ready cinematic prose the following morning. The airfield lay under a crust of white. The wind had carved lines across the snow, curling it against hangar doors and broken crates. A strange calm had settled, the kind that often came before bad news. Mallory arrived early, before anyone else. The air bit into his lungs as he walked across the tarmac. His boots crunched in rhythm with his thoughts, steady, cold, relentless. He unlocked the hangar and stepped inside. The smell of oil and iron wrapped around him like a familiar ghost. Everything was as he'd left it. The burnt engine block, the scribbled notes, the lamp hanging crooked over his workbench, and on the table, still where he'd written it, was the word vapor. He ran his thumb over the smudge of pencil. A small word, but it felt heavier than anything he'd written before. All morning he couldn't shake it. The thought of that kettle, the hiss, the warmth travelling through thin metal, keeping the water alive. He replayed it over and over in his mind, steam turning to condensation, condensation returning to steam, a cycle of life inside heat and metal. He pulled the carburetor diagram closer and stared at the narrow throat where the ice always formed. The cold wasn't the true enemy, stagnation was. The air moved too quickly, the pressure dropped, the temperature fell, and moisture froze in seconds. But what if, he wondered, he could keep that small passage warm? Not by brute force, not by electricity or open flame, but by the engine's own breath. He could almost hear the kettle whistling in his mind. By midday, the hangar filled with life again, footsteps, laughter, the sound of wrenches striking metal. Peter walked in, carrying 2 mugs of tea. "You look like you've been awake since the dark ages," he said. Mallory didn't answer. He was hunched over a piece of copper tubing, tracing his finger along it as if it might speak back. Peter frowned. "You're thinking again, aren't you?" Mallory finally looked up. His eyes were bloodshot but alive. "Steam moves through metal faster than air. Do you know that?" Peter blinked. "What are you talking about? The kettle?" Mallory said quietly. "The heat travels through the lid into the air above. It keeps the condensation moving, keeps it from freezing. Arthur," Peter sighed, "we're not brewing tea at 20,000 feet." But Mallory didn't hear the sarcasm. His mind was already somewhere else, deep inside the engine, following invisible currents of heat and air. He found an old length of copper tubing on a shelf and began bending it by hand. The metal resisted, but he coaxed it into shape, a loop, then a curve, then a thin duct that could wrap around the carburetor throat like a protective hand. Peter watched in silence for a while, then muttered, "You're serious?" Mallory nodded. "If I can draw a little warmth from the exhaust manifold, feed it through this line, maybe, just maybe, it'll stop the ice before it starts." Peter crossed his arms. "You'll cook the whole assembly." "Not if it's balanced. Just enough heat to breathe." The words hung there, fragile but certain. He worked through the afternoon, shaping, cutting, joining. The sound of hammer on metal echoed like slow music in the hangar. When the others left for supper, he stayed behind. Outside, the snow had turned to sleet. The wind rattled the tin walls like an impatient hand. Inside, Mallory soldered the last joint, then stepped back. The prototype looked absurd, a Frankenstein contraption of copper coils and scavenged parts. But he smiled. For the first time in weeks, he felt warmth in his chest that didn't come from tea or fire. He attached the duct to a small test engine. The fit was clumsy, but it held. He checked the valves, wiped his hands on his coat, and whispered to himself, "All right, then. Let's see if you can breathe." The engine coughed to life, sputtering before catching its rhythm. He watched the gauge, the needle trembling just below freezing. He adjusted the valve, letting a trickle of exhaust warmth through the copper line. Slowly, the temperature climbed. Then, something remarkable happened. The frost that usually crawled along the carburetor began to melt. Tiny droplets ran down the metal, glimmering in the lamplight. The sound changed smoother, steadier, alive. Mallory stepped closer, afraid to blink. His breath fogged in the air. "Come on," he whispered. "Stay with me." The minutes passed. No ice, no stall. Just the steady hum of life. A quiet laugh escaped him, not loud, not joyous, but disbelieving. For the first time in months, the machine didn't die. When Peter returned, he found Mallory sitting beside the still, running engine, face lit by the orange glow of the exhaust. "It's working," Mallory said softly. Peter hesitated, watching the frostless carburetor. "Bloody hell." "It's simple," Mallory murmured. "Warmth where cold once ruled. The answer was always there in the air itself." Peter shook his head. "No one will believe it." "They don't have to," Mallory said. "They'll hear it." He reached out and tapped the metal casing, listening to the steady hum echo back. By dawn, the engine had run 6 straight hours without icing. When the fuel finally ran dry, the silence felt sacred. Mallory leaned against the wall, exhausted but awake in a way he hadn't felt in years. His fingers trembled as he wrote in his notebook, "Vapor theory confirmed. Redirect exhaust heat through insulated copper ducts. Maintain airflow. Prevent condensation freeze." He underlined it twice. For a long moment he just sat there, the cold creeping back into the hangar, his breath visible in the dim light. Then he closed his eyes. He thought of the pilots, of the nights he'd heard their voices vanish into static. Maybe, just maybe, that silence could end. Later that morning, Colonel Graves returned. His face carried the weariness of too many sleepless nights and too many bad reports. "I hear you've been busy," he said, stepping into the hangar. Mallory gestured toward the engine. "I think I've found something." Graves arched an eyebrow. "Another experiment." "Yes, sir, but this one, it works." Graves folded his arms. "That's what the last man said before he burned half the hangar down." "Then let me show you," Mallory said. His voice was steady, but his heart pounded. He started the engine again. The roar filled the space, echoing off steel walls. Steam rose faintly from the copper lines, the air shimmering with heat. Minutes passed. No frost, no sputter, just smooth, even power. Graves watched in silence, his face unreadable. Then, finally, he exhaled. "How long has it been running like this?" 7 hours cumulative. Mallory replied. "No icing." Graves stepped closer, inspecting the copper ducts. "What am I looking at? A way to stop the cold from killing our engines." Mallory said quietly, "A way to keep them breathing." Graves stared at him, then at the machine. "You're telling me a few bits of kitchen pipe are going to save the Royal Air Force?" Mallory met his eyes. "If it keeps one man alive, sir, yes." The colonel didn't answer. He just nodded once, turned on his heel, and left without another word. For a moment, Mallory feared the worst, but that evening, a message arrived at his bench, a single sheet, folded neatly, approved for limited field test, Northolt Airfield, 0600. Mallory read it 3 times. His hands shook, not from fear this time, but from something else, anticipation. He looked back at the copper tubing, at the machine that had once mocked him with failure. Now it seemed almost alive, like it had been waiting for him to listen. He smiled faintly. "All right then," he whispered. "Let's see if you can fly." That night, the sky over the airfield was clear for once. Stars burned through the black, cold and distant. The hum of generators filled the silence. Mallory walked the runway alone, the note from Graves tucked in his pocket. He could feel the chill cutting through his coat, the damp seeping into his boots. But inside, there was warmth, a quiet fire that no frost could touch. He paused halfway down the strip, looked up at the dark sky, and let out a long breath. Somewhere beyond those clouds, men were fighting for survival, not just from bullets or bombs, but from the elements themselves. And maybe, just maybe, what he'd built in that battered hangar could tip the balance. He closed his eyes and listened. The night air was still, but in his mind, he could hear the sound of engines not choking, not dying, but alive. When dawn broke, a pale light spilled across the hangar floor. Mallory stood ready beside the test plane, his copper ducts gleaming faintly beneath the engine cowling. He didn't know what would happen next. Success or failure, recognition or ruin, none of it mattered. All that mattered was that he had found a way to keep warmth alive in the coldest place imaginable. The impossible problem was no longer impossible, only untested. And as the first rays of sunlight struck the runway, Arthur Mallory knew one truth that would carry him through everything to come sometimes. It isn't genius that saves lives, it's obsession. And the courage to boil a kettle when the world is burning. The snow had melted into a thin, grey slush by the time word of the test reached headquarters. What had begun as a small, desperate experiment now whispered through the corridors of command like rumour. They called it Mallory's kettle trick. No one said it with respect. Inside the briefing rooms of London, where maps were pinned with red threads and cigarette smoke curled like ghosts above the table, the officers didn't see brilliance, they saw a distraction. The RAF needed results, not theories. So when the report crossed Colonel Graves's desk, stamped with the words "preliminary success," it came with another note scrawled across the bottom in sharp, dismissive ink. Unverified. Conduct proper field trials immediately. Accountability. Mallory. Back at the airfield, the days grew longer and heavier. The thaw brought mud that clung to boots and wheels alike. Planes sank into it, engines roared, and everywhere there was movement, the kind born of desperation, not progress. Mallory's invention, his copper-lunged contraption, had earned him more eyes than applause. The mechanics watched him work like he was performing witchcraft. Some smiled behind his back, others didn't bother to hide their doubt. They said it couldn't last. They said a kettle and a few bits of pipe wouldn't win the war. But Mallory didn't answer them. He worked. Every morning he stood before the test engine, checked the ducts, measured the pressure, and logged the data by hand. It was no longer an experiment, it was a ritual. Peter noticed the change first. "You're quieter," he said one afternoon, handing over a sandwich that Mallory forgot to eat. "I have to be," Mallory replied, eyes fixed on the temperature gauge. "Every hour that passes without icing is another hour I can't afford to waste." Peter leaned against the bench. "You know what they're saying, right? That command's sending an inspector, someone from the ministry." Mallory looked up, his face unreadable. "Let them come." Peter hesitated. "Arthur, they're not coming to praise you, I know." And with that he turned back to his machine. The copper lines hummed faintly under his touch, like veins carrying a heartbeat. The inspector arrived 3 days later, Major Quentin Harris, a man polished to perfection, his boots reflecting more light than the hangar windows. He didn't shake hands, didn't smile. He merely opened his notebook and said, "Show me." Mallory obliged. He started the engine, adjusted the valve, and stood aside as the machine began its song. The major watched silently, jotting notes with mechanical precision. After 10 minutes, he asked, "And the ice?" "None," Mallory replied. "At any altitude equivalent." Harris raised an eyebrow. "You're using exhaust heat to warm the carburetor throat." "Yes." "And you believe that's sustainable?" "I don't believe, Major," Mallory said quietly. "I've seen it." The major shut his notebook with a soft snap. "Belief and proof aren't the same thing, Mr. Mallory. The ministry will require a demonstration under combat conditions." Mallory's jaw tightened. "Meaning a live flight test, North Sea route. You'll oversee the modification yourself, and if it fails—" He paused, his voice dry as paper. "Then you'll be accountable for every drop of fuel wasted and every life lost." He left without another word. The echo of his boots lingered long after. That night, the airfield was silent again. Mallory stood beside the test plane under the hangar lamps, the copper ducts gleaming like veins of light against the dark metal. Peter joined him, coat pulled tight. "They're sending a pilot tomorrow," he said. "Volunteer from 84 Squadron." Mallory nodded slowly. "A volunteer." Peter hesitated. "Do you think it'll hold?" Mallory didn't answer. He was staring at the faint curl of frost already forming on the plane's wing, as if the cold were listening, waiting to strike. Finally he whispered, "It has to." The next morning, the test began before sunrise. The sky was the color of ash. The pilot, a man named William Reeves, climbed into the cockpit without ceremony. He was young, calm, the kind of man who smiled before dangerous things. Mallory checked the connections one last time, copper ducts tight, valves open, fuel steady. His hands shook slightly, though he tried to hide it. Reeves looked down at him from the cockpit and asked, "You sure about this contraption, sir?" Mallory met his gaze. "No, but I'm sure about what happens if we do nothing." Reeves grinned. "That'll do." The propellers spun to life, the sound growing from a cough to a roar. Frost clung to the wings, then broke away under the wind. The plane began to roll. Mallory and Peter stood at the edge of the runway, watching as the bomber lifted into the grey sky. The engines glowed faintly with heat, their rhythm smooth and constant. Minutes passed, then 10, then 20. The radio crackled a voice, thin and distant. "Northolt Control, this is Test Pilot Reeves. Altitude 25,000, airspeed constant, no icing." Mallory's heart stopped. "Repeat that," Peter said into the transmitter. "Still clear," Reeves replied, voice steadier now. "Engines holding smooth, temperature stable." Mallory closed his eyes. For the first time in months, the silence on the radio wasn't death, it was life. When the plane landed an hour later, the airfield erupted in cheers. Even the skeptical mechanics clapped as Reeves climbed down, frost glittering on his flight cap. He walked straight to Mallory, grinning. "Your kettle saved my skin up there." Mallory smiled faintly. "So it works." "Oh, it works," Reeves said. "Didn't even flinch at altitude. You've done something here, sir." For a fleeting moment, the hangar felt lighter, alive with relief. Men slapped each other's backs, shouted over the engine noise, laughed for the first time in weeks. But as the joy faded, Mallory's eyes drifted to the far horizon, the sky still grey, the clouds still waiting. He knew this was only the beginning. That evening the telegram came from London: further tests authorized, prepare additional units for installation, production pending results, Ministry of Aircraft Supply. Peter nearly dropped the message. They're taking it seriously. Mallory didn't celebrate. He only stared at the words for a long moment before folding the paper and slipping it into his pocket. "Now," he said softly, "the real pressure begins," and he was right. In the days that followed, engineers flooded the hangar. Crates of spare parts arrived, clipboards, uniforms, cameras. Suddenly, the quiet workshop was a stage and Mallory, its unwilling actor. Every move was watched, every adjustment questioned. His invention, once a fragile act of desperation, was now a military secret. Reporters wrote about a new system to protect engines from atmospheric failure. They didn't use his name, they never would. But that didn't matter. What mattered was that every bomber fitted with his system meant fewer graves. Still, the nights grew harder. He couldn't sleep. Not with the noise of tests echoing through the base, not with the image of frozen planes still burned behind his eyes. Sometimes he'd walk back to the hangar alone and sit beside the humming engines. The sound had become a kind of prayer, low, steady, alive. Peter found him there once, staring into the glow. "You can rest now," he said. "You've done it." Mallory shook his head slowly. "You don't understand. The war doesn't rest, neither can we." Peter smiled sadly. "You sound like the engines. Maybe that's the point," Mallory said. And outside, the wind kept blowing over the runways, carrying the faint scent of oil and frost. The problem that once seemed impossible was now a miracle, but miracles in wartime never come without a price. Mallory knew it. He could feel it in his bones. The next failure, if it came, would be his to bear alone. He turned one last time toward the sleeping sky and whispered, "Stay warm up there." The first week after the successful test felt like standing on thin ice, triumphant, but trembling. Mallory had proved his idea could work. Yet success in war was never a finish line. It was only an invitation for more demands. By the second morning, orders came from London for further trials. The steam duct system, as they called it now, was to be tested under every possible condition: freezing rain, sudden altitude drops, night flights through dense fog. They wanted proof not of survival, but of perfection. And perfection was something the cold did not allow. The engineers arrived in wavesmen in heavy coats, speaking in clipped tones, carrying measuring instruments and stopwatches. They filled the hangar like strangers in a church, poking at the engine as though it were a relic they didn't quite believe in. Mallory stood by, silent, as they recorded readings and argued over pressure ratios. One man, a senior researcher from Rolls-Royce, scoffed when he saw the copper tubes. "Crude," he muttered, "looks like plumbing from a farmhouse." Mallory didn't respond. He'd heard worse. He simply adjusted a valve, turned the ignition, and let the machine answer for him. The engine came to life with a clean, even hum. Steam hissed gently from the ducts, not wild, not violent, just steady, breathing warmth into the metal. The men quieted, the gauges held steady. No one said a word, but in their silence Mallory could hear the faintest crack in their doubt. That night he received another message from Colonel Graves. "Good work. Official recommendation pending further review. Keep all prototypes secure." It should have felt like victory, but all Mallory saw were the words pending and secure. They didn't understand. This wasn't about paperwork. It was about lives. Every delay meant another flight into frozen death. A few days later, the next test was scheduled, a high-altitude run across the Channel. A short flight on paper, but a lifetime in the sky. Reeves, the same volunteer pilot, would take the modified bomber again. The weather forecast was cruel. Sub-zero temperatures and strong crosswinds over the North Sea. Mallory checked every bolt himself, feeling the tension build like static in the air. Peter tried to reassure him. It held before, it'll hold again. Mallory didn't look up. Once is luck, twice is truth. Peter frowned. You don't sound like a man who just saved the Air Force. Mallory smiled faintly. No one saves the Air Force. We just give it one more chance. At 0:60 hours, the engines roared. Frost lifted from the wings as the bomber climbed into the sky, vanishing into a bank of clouds. The minutes that followed stretched like hours. Mallory stood near the radio, his hands clenched behind his back, eyes locked on the static SPECT dial. Nothing but white noise, then a voice, Reeves breathing hard. Northolt Control, this is Test Flight 2. Altitude 30, 1,000 feet. Conditions extreme, icing expected. Mallory held his breath. Static again, the line crackled. Then a calm voice returned. No icing. Repeat, no icing. She's running clean. Peter let out a long exhale, almost a laugh. He did it again. But Mallory didn't move. He was listening closely, not to the words, but to the tone behind them. There was something new there. Relief, yes, but also awe. Reeves continued, voice breaking slightly with static. Temperature dropping to -40. Still holding steady. That's impossible, isn't it? Mallory's throat tightened. It was, he whispered. The flight returned safely. The copper ducts glowed faintly as the bomber taxied in warm even in the icy air. When Reeves climbed out, his face was red from the cold, but his eyes were alive. You've changed everything, sir, he said. At 30,000 feet, I could feel it, the air stayed alive. Mallory simply nodded. Then it's not just theory anymore. Word spread quickly this time, not as rumour, but as certainty. Within a week, the Air Ministry had authorised production of the device. Factories would adapt, mechanics would train, and the Mallory modification would become standard issue. He should have been elated. But with recognition came intrusion. He was summoned to London for technical briefings, interviews, endless documentation. Each man who shook his hand seemed more interested in the patent than the purpose. At one meeting, an executive from the ministry smiled across the table. Your name will go down in history, Mr. Mallory. Mallory looked at the stack of papers before him, diagrams, supply orders, budget cuts, and said softly, History doesn't need names, it needs survivors. The man didn't understand. Few ever did. Back at the airfield, his hangar felt different. No longer his. The quiet had been replaced by chatter, by the sound of typewriters and cameras. They were calling it a triumph of British engineering, a symbol of resilience. But none of them had been there in the cold when men fell from the sky. None of them had stood beside a frozen engine and wondered how many lives it had taken. Mallory walked through the hangar at dusk, past crates stamped with serial numbers and insignias. His invention, once born of desperation, was now being replicated by the hundreds, and though he should have felt pride, what he felt instead was a strange emptiness, as if the soul had been drained from his work the moment it was claimed by the war machine. Peter found him that evening, sitting beside the quiet test engine. You should go home, he said. Get some sleep. You've done your part. Mallory didn't look up. It's strange, isn't it? You solve a problem, and it only creates new ones. Peter tilted his head. What do you mean? Mallory smiled faintly. Now that the planes can fly higher, longer, they'll push further, take greater risks, and more men will still die, just not the same way. Peter was silent for a moment. That's not on you, Arthur. Isn't it? Mallory whispered. That night, the sky burned red again, distant fires from another air raid. The war was still raging, indifferent to invention or genius. Mallory stood outside, hands in his coat pockets, watching the faint glow on the horizon. For a moment, he could almost hear the hum of engines far above, the sound of his creation carrying men through the night. It should have felt like hope. Instead, it felt like a burden. He thought of Reeves, of the other pilots who'd flown before him and never returned. Their voices echoed faintly in his memory-clipped transmissions, half-finished words, broken static. He wondered if they'd forgive him for being the one who solved it too late. Weeks passed, The system was officially adopted. Pilots began to report drastically fewer icing incidents. The statistics looked miraculous. But numbers never told the truth. Mallory knew that every figure, every percentage improvement, still represented a man, a crew, a risk. One evening he received a letter. It was from Reeves. The handwriting was uneven, the ink smudged. "We're flying with your system now on every mission. It's holding, Arthur, it's holding beautifully. You've saved more of us than you'll ever know." He folded the letter carefully and tucked it into his notebook. For the first time he allowed himself a small smile, not of pride but of peace. The following day Colonel Graves visited the hangar. He was quieter than usual, his coat dusted with ash from the nearby city. "London's pleased," he said. "They're calling it a breakthrough." Mallory nodded. "The pilots, alive." Graves said softly, "That's what matters." He hesitated, then added, "You did good work, Arthur. I know it cost you." Mallory looked at the engine, its copper lines gleaming in the half light. Everything cost something, he murmured. As night fell, the hangar lights dimmed one by one. The world outside remained at war, but inside, for the first time, there was quiet. Mallory sat alone, his hand resting on the metal casing of the engine, the same one that had once defied him, mocked him, challenged him to understand its cold heart. Now it was warm, alive. He whispered to it softly, as though to a living thing. "We did it." The hum of distant planes drifted through the darkness. He listened until it faded, replaced by the low sigh of the wind through the cracks in the hangar walls. And somewhere beyond the clouds, men flew safely through the night, carried by warmth born from one man's stubborn will to keep life from freezing over. It was spring of 1941 when the cold began to loosen its grip on Britain. The airfields, once locked in frost and silence, were alive again, engines growling, mechanics shouting, mud replaced by the scent of oil and thawed grass. But even as the snow melted, the war did not. The sky above London still carried the memory of fire. At night, the horizon glowed faintly orange, the last embers of raids that never truly stopped. And somewhere between the chaos of the cities and the calm of the countryside, Arthur Mallory lived in the quiet space between exhaustion and discovery. He'd been moved to a smaller research station outside Oxfordshire, a low cluster of sheds hidden behind a line of trees where the ministry sent its special projects. It was meant as a reward, but it felt more like exile. Mallory's workshop was a converted barn walls of corrugated metal, a single window that caught the morning light, and a small table cluttered with tools, notes, and cups of cold tea. He spent his days refining the system that had saved so many, calculating airflow efficiency, testing alloys, and documenting results for the ministry's archives. But the excitement that had once driven him was gone. He had solved the problem, and in solving it, he had lost something, the raw fire that once burned in the quiet hours before dawn. Now his work was repetition, maintenance, reports. He missed the chaos of discovery, the nights when every idea felt impossible, yet somehow alive. Peter still visited when he could. He'd been transferred to a different base, but friendship, like habit, was hard to kill. He arrived one grey morning, boots muddy, coat open, and grinned as he stepped through the door. "Still haunting the same ghosts, I see." Mallory smiled faintly. "You make it sound like I have a choice." Peter looked around at the room. "You've turned into a legend, you know. They're fitting your ducks on every aircraft now. Even the Yanks are asking about them." Mallory's expression didn't change. "They don't have my name on them." Peter shrugged. "Maybe that's for the best. Fame's a heavy thing to carry in wartime." Mallory looked down at his hands, calloused, stained with oil and ink. "I didn't do it for fame. I know," Peter said quietly. "That's why it worked." Outside, the rain began to fall soft at first, then harder, drumming against the metal roof like distant artillery. Mallory poured 2 cups of tea and sat down opposite his friend. For a while they drank in silence, listening to the rain and the hum of the small heater in the corner. Then Peter asked, "So what now? You've done your part. You could go home." Mallory stared into his cup. "And do what? Pretend the world isn't burning?" Peter hesitated. "You can't fix everything." "No," Mallory said, "but I can try to understand it." He reached for his notebook and flipped to a blank page. For weeks he had been sketching strange shapes, air ducts, yes. but also patterns of condensation, temperature gradients, airflow through thin pipes. "What are you working on?" Peter asked. Mallory's pencil moved slowly, almost dreamlike. "It started as an improvement to the heat system, but it's something else now, something I can't quite see yet." Peter chuckled. "You're not building another kettle, are you?" Mallory smiled faintly. "Maybe, or maybe I'm just trying to listen to the steam again." That night, long after Peter left, Mallory stayed awake. The storm had passed, leaving behind a deep, humming stillness, the kind of silence that invited thought. He set the kettle on the small stove, a ritual more than a need, and watched as the water began to tremble. The sound filled the small room, gentle and familiar. Steam rose, curling through the air, catching the light from the lamp. He leaned closer, mesmerized by it, the way it danced, the way it vanished. He picked up a magnifying glass from his desk and held it near the rising vapor. Tiny droplets shimmered in the beam of light, forming and fading in perfect rhythm. He whispered to himself, "It's alive." He reached for his notes pages filled with temperature readings and diagrams. Something had been bothering him for weeks. The system worked, yes, but it worked by accident as much as by design. What if the key wasn't just warmth? What if the real answer was in how warmth moved? He thought back to the kettle, how the heat rose, condensed, then fell again. A cycle, not a line, a living system, self-sustaining. He began to sketch a new design, circular ducts that could feed back into themselves, recycling heat more efficiently. Not just to prevent ice, but to stabilize temperature across the entire engine body. The lines came easily, flowing like thought itself. For the first time in months, he felt that old spark returned, the pulse of creation, the feeling that something extraordinary was just out of reach, waiting to be born. By dawn, his desk was covered in sketches. The air smelled of burnt paper and cold tea. He stood by the window, watching the first light stretch across the fields. He didn't know what he had yet, only that it was something new, something beautiful in its simplicity. And beauty, he'd learned, often hid the most powerful truths. He closed his notebook and tucked it into his coat pocket. Tomorrow, he'd show it to Graves if the colonel would even listen. But for now, he allowed himself to rest his eyes and breathe. The war still roared beyond those quiet hills, but inside that small, forgotten barn, a new idea had been born, one that would change everything again. That morning, as he stepped outside, the air was clear and sharp. Birdsong mixed with the distant growl of engines from the nearby base. He smiled faintly, a rare thing for him, and began the walk down the muddy path toward the airstrip. In his pocket, the notebook felt warm, almost alive. Inside it, a few sketched lines, nothing more but enough to light a path forward. He didn't know it yet, but the inspiration that had returned in that quiet storm would carry him into the next great chapter of his life, the chapter where invention would meet resistance, and genius would demand sacrifice. The morning mist hung low over the airfield, soft and silver, as Arthur Mallory made his way toward headquarters. In his hand, wrapped in brown paper, was his notebook, the one that had kept him awake through the storm. Each step across the damp grass echoed like a heartbeat. He could feel the weight of it, not the paper, but the idea. It wasn't pride that filled him, nor hope. It was something quieter, a knowing. The same feeling he'd had before everything changed, when a simple kettle had whispered the secret of survival. Colonel Graves was already at his desk when Mallory entered. The old man looked more tired than usual, his eyes shadowed by sleepless nights. The war had aged everyone. Even the air itself seemed older, now heavier, worn by the constant thunder of machines. Mallory placed the wrapped notebook on the table. "I've been working on something new," he said. Graves raised an eyebrow, half curious, half wary. "New? You've already saved half the fleet, Arthur. What's left to build?" Mallory hesitated, searching for the right words. "The steam duct works because it keeps one part alive, but the whole engine still suffers from imbalance. The cold eats at the wings, the lines, the intake. I think we can use the same principle to even it out, spread warmth where it's needed." Graves leaned back in his chair, folding his arms, and what would that accomplish? Efficiency. Mallory said softly, "Altitude without exhaustion, endurance without failure. It's not about flying higher anymore, Colonel, it's about lasting longer." Graves stared at him, saying nothing. The silence stretched until it became almost uncomfortable. Finally he sighed. "You don't stop, do you?" Mallory smiled faintly. "Would you if you'd seen what I've seen?" Graves didn't answer. He unwrapped the notebook, flipping through the sketches, the notes, the loops of pencil where genius hid inside messy handwriting. After a moment, he looked up. "You'll have to prove it again." Mallory nodded. "I know." Back in the workshop, Mallory began again. The smell of metal and oil was a comfort now, a reminder that creation always began in chaos. He stripped the side of a spare engine, fitting copper and steel like puzzle pieces. Each adjustment brought him closer to something fluid, something alive. The design was simple, a series of ducts that circled the engine, allowing heat to flow evenly across its body. It was elegant, self-balancing, efficient. But it was also untested, unapproved, and unauthorized. Peter arrived halfway through the day, wiping rain from his cap. "You're doing it again, aren't you?" Mallory didn't look up. "Doing what?" "Chasing ghosts through metal." Mallory smiled without humor. "Ghosts have better ideas than men, sometimes." Peter sighed. "You know they'll never let you install that. The ministry's happy enough with what you've already done." Mallory tightened a bolt. "Then I'll do it without their permission." Peter froze. But Mallory didn't stop. His hands moved faster, guided by something beyond reason, the same quiet instinct that had once turned boiling water into survival. The first prototype looked strange, more sculpture than machine. Thin copper veins wrapped the engine like vines. Small valves hissed softly as they breathed. It was beautiful in its own way, imperfect, experimental, alive. Mallory stood back, wiping the sweat from his brow, and whispered, "All right, then. Let's see if you can sing." He turned the key. The engine coughed once, twice, then caught. The sound filled the hangar, not rough, not strained, but smooth, steady, like a deep breath. The temperature gauges stabilized almost instantly. The vibrations were lower, calmer. The entire unit seemed to hum in quiet harmony. Peter stared. "It's balanced." Mallory nodded. "It's breathing evenly." "How heat doesn't fight cold anymore," Mallory said. "It flows with it, but even beauty can be dangerous." After 20 minutes, one of the ducts overheated and burst with a sharp hiss. Steam filled the room, searing Mallory's arm before he could step back. Peter grabbed him by the shoulders. "You're bleeding." Mallory waved him off, coughing through the mist. Pressure imbalance, too much flow through the secondary line. Peter stared at him. "You could have killed yourself." Mallory wiped soot from his face and smiled through the pain. "Then it means I'm close." For days, he worked without rest. His bandaged arm stiffened, but he ignored it. Every failure gave birth to another correction, another small miracle. And every night he returned to the same thought, the kettle, the steam, the dance between heat and air. It wasn't about machines anymore. It was about nature, about balance. He began to see the engine not as a tool of war, but as a living organism, one that needed to breathe, to circulate, to maintain its own rhythm. When he spoke of it aloud, Peter would shake his head. "You make it sound human." Mallory would smile softly. "Maybe that's why it works." By the end of the week, the new system was ready. He had refined the ducts, adjusted the flow, added safety valves. This time he was certain, but he also knew the ministry wouldn't approve another test flight. Too much risk, too little oversight, so he made a decision. That night, long after the base lights dimmed, Mallory and Peter rolled the modified test plane onto the runway. The wind was cold, the sky clear. "Arthur," Peter said, his voice trembling slightly, "if this goes wrong, I know." Mallory interrupted. "But if it goes right, we'll never have to fear the cold again." He climbed into the cockpit. Peter hesitated. "You're not sending someone else this time." Mallory looked at him. "If it fails, it should fail with me." The propellers spun, slicing through the silence. The plane rolled forward, gaining speed, lifting gracefully into the air. The ground fell away beneath him. The fields, the lights, the world all shrinking to nothing. Inside the cockpit, Mallory listened to the hum of the engine. It was different, calmer, the vibrations smoother, the sound lower. It felt right at 10,000 feet. The air grew colder. He checked the gauges steady. At 20,000, frost began to bloom on the wings. The ducts hissed softly, warming in response. At 30,000, the air outside was death itself, sharp, invisible, absolute. But inside, the engine sang. Mallory felt the warmth beneath his feet, the steadiness in the controls. He exhaled slowly. For a moment, he forgot the war. He forgot the noise, the fear, the orders. There was only the rhythm of the machine, the pulse of life born from his own stubbornness. He banked the plane left, watching the horizon tilt, the curve of the earth painted in grey and gold. Balance, he whispered, that's all it ever needed. Then, suddenly, a warning light flickered. Pressure spike, he adjusted the valve, steady hands on trembling controls. The copper ducts hissed louder. Steam began to fog the edges of the glass. The temperature held steady, but the strain was visible. The engine groaned like a living thing fighting for breath. Mallory gritted his teeth, hold together, just a little longer. He eased the throttle, letting the system stabilize. The hissing slowed, the pressure dropped. The light faded, then silence, not failure, not loss, just silence. He had done it. The engine hummed in perfect harmony. Warmth flowed evenly through every duct, every plate. He had created not just a system, but a heartbeat. When he landed, the world seemed brighter. Peter ran to him as the propellers slowed. "You're mad," he shouted, half in anger, half in awe. Mallory climbed down, his face pale but smiling. "Madness and genius are neighbours, Peter. Sometimes they share a door." Peter stared at the plane, the faint steam rising from its sides. "So it worked," Mallory nodded. "It's not a machine anymore, it's alive." The next morning, Graves arrived with 2 officials from London. They'd already heard about the unauthorized flight. Mallory stood before them, calm, almost serene. "You disobeyed direct orders." One of them said coldly. "You risked government property and your own life." Mallory met his gaze. "And I proved what your reports never could." The man frowned. "And what's that?" Mallory's voice was quiet, steady. "That warmth, when guided, can save us from anything, even ourselves." They didn't arrest him. They couldn't, the data was undeniable, but they did classify the new design, sealing it away in military archives. Officially, it never existed. Still, within months, quiet changes appeared in the new engine model's smoother heat regulation, improved endurance. The fingerprints of his forgotten design. No one mentioned his name, but Mallory didn't care. He never wanted fame, he wanted peace. And that night, as he stood by his small stove, the kettle began to whistle once more. He smiled to himself, watching the steam rise into the lamplight. It always began the same way, with warmth, with patience, with a whisper from something ordinary. He poured himself a cup, sat down, and wrote 4 words at the top of a fresh page: "Balance is the key."